Faultlines.
Welcome back to Faultlines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Austin Pelly, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And we've been having this conversation about Joe Biden and the actions that are taking place in Ukraine and some of the policies, or for that matter, some of the things that Joe Biden has said that created all sorts of confusion on that particular issue. In a meeting that came out between Lavrov and Blinken, it seemed as if Blinken came out of that meeting a little bit more conciliatory than he was when he went into that meeting. And recently, Biden has basically said that he's weighing sending 50,000 troops to Europe. Again, all of this is to counter, quote unquote, Russian aggression. And we're going to get into whether or not these 50,000 troops are going to matter. And for that matter, if they're not, then why is Biden sending them? To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. Scott, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you?
So far, so good. Better that you are joining us. So apparently, Biden has been deliberating on whether or not to send 50,000 troops to the Ukraine. To Eastern Europe. And the question becomes, is that 50,000 really going to matter if anything goes wrong in the Ukraine? 50,000 seems inadequate to really have this kind of this protection of the Ukraine in the way that Biden and Blinken and some of these guys are basically talking about. For that matter, even this protection of other states beyond Ukraine that are not necessarily, or that are part of NATO, but that basically, I guess, feel some kind of way with all of this talk taking place with all of these kind of negotiations. That's somewhat of a tortured way to put it. But I guess what I'm getting at is, what is 50,000 troops going to do one way or the other in Europe?
Well, I mean, look, let's be frank. If it was the right 50,000 and under the right circumstances, a 50,000-man armored corps from the United States, permanently stationed in Europe, able to rapidly deploy in a high state of combat readiness, is Russia's nightmare. So, yeah, no, I mean, if Biden could do that, he'll be a game changer. Not for Ukraine, but anybody who sits there and fears about an emboldened Russia taking action against the Baltic states or Poland, a 50,000 man U.S. corps, two plus divisions, you don't mess with that.
It is a big deal, basically.
It's a huge deal. But that's not what Biden's doing. So let's just stop pretending that fantasy is out there. We don't have 50,000 troops in a core organization that can be sent to Europe. I mean, so that's like me, being the Emperor of Rome, saying if I had 50 legions, I could take over the world. Yes, you could, Emperor, but you don't have 50 legions. You might have 3.
But you think he's doing this purely for the political point of shoring up support among European allies, like Baltic states or allies in like Eastern Europe, that this is more so for the optics of it, not necessarily for the reality of it, because we don't necessarily have the troops to give them in this way. Is that the thought?
It's not just that. It's about NATO. It's about emboldening NATO. Notice what Kirby was saying when he spoke about these 8,500 troops. That's what we're talking about, 8,500. He said they're going to be deployed if NATO activates its rapid intervention brigade or force. And then he spoke about troops that are earmarked for the 40,000-person NATO rapid intervention force. And then within that is the very rapid deployment force. I mean, NATO has some wonderful names. And then we have troops that are earmarked for that. So in short, we have an airborne brigade in Italy, the 173rd. That's earmarked as part of the very rapid deployment. So if NATO were to activate that unit, then those paratroopers would be earmarked for joining that unit, and they're on the hook now, on the leash, according to Kirby, to be used. Now, remember what we're talking about here: paratroopers. Okay, they can't fight. Not in a modern war. Paratroopers on the ground are speed bumps to Russian tanks. So right off the bat, it's a joke. It's just a non-entity. Now, the other people he's talking about is basically a brigade out of Germany. It's a Stryker brigade, we call it. It's basically an 8-wheeled light armored vehicle. We went to the Stryker brigade during the global war on terrorism because it was impractical for us to be sending tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles to Afghanistan and Iraq. So we came up with the Stryker concept. That may work in a low-intensity conflict world, but Strykers in Europe are useless. So even if NATO does mobilize this fantastic rapid deployment force, and by the way, that's not a given, because in order for NATO to do that, you need all 30 members to say, yes, we want to mobilize. It's not something that the Secretary General or a handful of nations decide to do. You need unanimous consent. And keep in mind that there's nations like Germany right now who are very hesitant. Turkey is very hesitant. Turkey's right now thinking they're going to play peacemaker. Erdogan's talking about going in and being a moderator between Ukraine and Russia. So Biden lives in a fantasy world. He's put out this number, first of all, 8,500, which is a meaningless number because these aren't real combat forces. They are a joke. The 40,000 person rapid deployment force has never trained together as a unit. Imagine putting 40,000 people on the field in combat who have never trained together as a 40,000-man unit. They would be annihilated. They wouldn't stand a chance, a snowball's chance in hell. NATO is a joke. That's the problem here. That's what's going on. NATO failed in Afghanistan, was humiliated in Afghanistan by the United States. And they were sent packing, and NATO is now desperate for some relevance. And so what Biden is doing is using the Ukrainian fiasco as a mechanism to breathe relevance into NATO by pretending that NATO has a rapid response capability. They don't. This is all fan fiction.
You know, Scott, I'm curious, on strictly Biden's decision here, if he decides to send these troops. I've heard the argument before. I mean, I was fully, and I still kind of am being drawn to the side of the camp of a war is not good for Biden. But, his approval ratings seems like he needs something anyway. So maybe a shakeup that would be a war would help him in the long term. But if he sends these troops over, I mean, I could only see that as disastrous for his presidency. What do you think, Scott?
First of all, there will be no war between the United States and Russia. Even sending these troops over doesn't constitute a war. What it constitutes is embarrassment. Because what's happening here is that Biden is flexing. I mean, I liken it to, this. He thinks he's a teenager in his mother's basement flexing in the mirror, pretending that he's Rocky Balboa, ready to take on Ivan Drago. Okay, that's where his fantasy mind is. But now we got Ivan Drago in the ring. That's called the Russian army. It's real. It's there. It's huge. He's serious. But it ain't Rocky that's downstairs in the basement. It's a middle-aged old flabby man who's flexing to himself, trying to impress himself. Biden can't get in the ring. NATO can't get in the ring. And yet he's pretending that he can. Americans need to literally engage their brains. If we take troops out of a base in Italy and we parachute them into the Baltics, how long can we sustain them? Not very long. If we take a brigade out of Germany and drive it across the Polish plains, so they're in eastern Poland, okay, now they're there. How long can we sustain them? Not very long. We no longer have the capacity in Europe to do this. We used to back in the good old days, in the Cold War, when we had 213,000 troops and facilities and depots and ammunition storage and fuel storage and everything. We could do this. We don't have any of that. That's all gone away. And so, he's going to flex with 8,500 troops that are meaningless, who may never be mobilized because NATO may never agree to mobilize. But even if they do, they get over there, and then all the Russians have to do is wait 4 months. And in 4 months, we got to pull them out because they're not a permanent force. Now, if you want a permanent force, then you got to go to Congress and say, give me, a recurring budget addition of around $10 to $15 billion a year. And Congress is going to, the reason why we don't have that capability is that Congress made a decision a while back. They don't want to spend that kind of money. And so, this is a joke. And the other thing is, it just proves Russia's point that NATO is an irresponsible organization without a viable mission whose sole purpose is to confront Russia. Therefore, if that's the stance NATO wants to take, then Russia has NATO has just basically legitimized Russia's position vis-a-vis Ukraine and Georgia, meaning that since NATO has proven itself to be an irresponsible organization, we can never allow these two nations to consider joining NATO.
So is this basically a situation of image management, and the image management having a lot to do with how NATO is perceived by basically NATO nations? And so this is, like you said, we don't have the troops to send for this, and NATO is basically a shell of what it used to be. By the same token, Biden needs to get across to the diverse members of NATO, whether it's Estonia, even if it's tiny Estonia, that the U.S. and I guess the other nations will come to their fight and everything else, especially with all of the talk around the issues of Ukraine. So it's almost as if it's kind of this kind of paper tiger that Biden has to take certain actions or say certain things in order to get across that we will back you and we will support you, regardless of what it looks like on the ground. You still have our backing and support. I mean, is that what's going on? I mean, because if so, that makes this look that much worse than what the situation already was. But what are your thoughts, Scott? Is that what's going on?
It's exactly what's going on. Remember, this is Joe Biden. And the reason why I say that is Americans seem to have forgotten a July 23rd conversation last summer that Joe Biden had with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, in which Ghani said, dude, I got 20,000 Taliban and Pakistani insurgents pouring across my border. We're getting the snot kicked out of us. You have to stay here and give us air support or we're done. This thing's collapsing in a week. And Biden went, whoa, buddy, stop. I need you to get on TV and tell everybody everything's okay. It's all going to be okay. Everything's... I need you to create that perception. And this is a quote from Biden, even if it isn't the truth. And what happened in Afghanistan was that because of the lie, Afghanistan collapsed and everybody's taken by surprise. He's telling the same lie right now in Europe to create the perception of NATO credibility, American credibility. It's not there.
So Scott, we've heard before that NATO is essentially proxy U.S. And what they do is pretty much a lot of the U.S. puppeteering. Not entirely, but that to a degree. So I know that just by the restrictions that NATO has already set out, Ukraine cannot enter. They definitely have a conflict of their border right now, just to determine there's a territory conflict there. So if the U.S. strong arms the rest of NATO, or if NATO was able to bring Ukraine into NATO, I know that Russia has said that if you do that, we will invade. But take out Russia. Is there anyone in NATO who would kind of call out that that hypocrisy and say, like, no, we have these rules in for a reason. There's not a chance outside of it being like, oh, it just means that Russia's going to invade.
Yeah, Germany, France, it's not just that Russia would invade. It's that NATO would go automatically to war with Russia. So if NATO were to waive all of its rules, and remember, it's not just the internal border conflicts. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt nations in the world. Ukraine is also a nation that is infested with neo-Nazi ideology. Ukraine is a fake nation. Anybody who looks at the modern history of Ukraine knows that post-World War II, Poland gave up a big chunk of eastern Poland that the Soviets took over and gave to Ukraine. And those people that live in western Ukraine identify themselves as Poles, not Ukrainians. The people that live in eastern Ukraine identify as Russians, not Ukrainians. There hasn't been. Ukraine is a fake state created by the Soviet Union to get an extra vote on the Security Council of the United Nations. It doesn't have any national institutions worthy of the name. It was an industrial it was an industrial center for the Soviet Union, but everything flowed not through Kiev but through Moscow. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed and this entity called Ukraine stood up, there was nothing real there. It was corrupt from day one. And now what we see out of the western part of Ukraine is that it's infested with neo-Nazi ideology. What the hell are we doing associating with these people? That's the thing. So, there's nations in NATO right now that know that Ukraine is not viable. But let's say they waived all this and said, Ukraine, you're going to join. The second Ukraine joined, they would, you have, for instance, in Lugansk or Crimea, you automatically have a situation where, by definition, Russia has violated the sovereignty of Ukraine. Therefore, Article 5 automatically kicks in, automatically, collective defense, and now NATO must engage in a war against Russia. No one in NATO is going to allow that to happen. Everybody can talk about it. You can hear all these people. I mean, I watch the idiots on TV talk about it all the time. People that should be respected, like Wesley Clark and others. Yes, Ukraine should be allowed in. And you really think Germany is going to vote for an automatic state of war with Russia? So Ukrainian membership in NATO is a pipe dream. It will never happen. But the problem isn't Ukrainian membership in NATO. It's Ukraine becoming a proxy member of NATO. That's what Russia's objecting to as well. And when you pour in $600 million worth of lethal aid in the span of a week, when you have NATO military members training and advising the Ukrainian army, trying to turn the Ukrainian army into a clone of a NATO-type military, deploying Ukrainian forces into Iraq and Afghanistan as part of a NATO mission, it doesn't matter if Ukraine's not a member of NATO. They're a NATO-like state, and Russia will object to that. And that's what Russia is objecting to right now, because we know that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. But they don't need to be a member of NATO to act like they're a member of NATO, and that's what's happening today.
So from your assessment on all of this, as you, I guess, I don't want to say look forward into the future, maybe looking back into the past, everybody gets that there are no good outcomes for this situation. No good outcomes. I mean, even from the standpoint of Europe and their own constituencies and what they need for themselves to be secure on something like this. I mean, is this the thing that basically pushes Europe into developing a foreign policy separate from the United States? Or we're not there yet? I mean, because this is, if you think of like each of the different nation states, well, they have their own priorities in regards to what they want. And some of them have been bringing up this notion of either a EU military or at the very least a military that deviates from what the U.S. interest is. So what are your thoughts on this?
President Macron of France has been talking about this for some time. Germany has been hinting at it. There's a couple things. One, the European economies, the EU, the Euro, they operate on a system that is designed for maximum efficiency. What I mean by that is there isn't much slop there, and that's great when you're doing the accounting. You want to make sure that every cent or euro is maximized for efficiency. But it's horrible if there's a disruption in the supply chain, if there's a disruption in energy, etc. Europe is very vulnerable to economic collapse, and that's what's going to happen if Russian energy, for instance, gets cut off, or if there's a major war. It also will happen if you take these finely tuned economies that have achieved their current status based upon the so-called peace dividend coming out of the Cold War, meaning that, for instance, Germany used to have a military of around 500,000 troops. They're down to 60,000 troops. Now, when they had 500,000 troops, they were sort of a relevant military. They had 12 armored divisions. That's pretty cool. They got today basically 2 armored brigades, and they can't even get those out of barracks. So when you talk about building a European military, they don't have the money or the political will for it. So Macron can sit there and talk all he wants about this stuff, but they don't have the money to do this. That's just the absolute truth. This is why Europe has been hesitant a lot of European countries have been hesitant to meet the 2% GDP cap put out by the United States, sort of a prerequisite for a viable NATO. They don't have the money. Their economies aren't geared to diverting that kind of money to the military. So yeah, this is going to be a come to Jesus moment for Europe, because this is if they push Russia, Russia's going to expose a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of weakness, a lot of fraud, a lot of deceit, and it's going to be a problem not just for Europe but for the United States. I mean, we got idiots in Congress who are very good at getting up and giving speeches, but none of them understand the reality of what it would take. For instance, we go back to the start of the conversation. I think the most stabilizing thing the United States could do is to put 50,000 heavy armored troops in Europe, permanently garrisoned. That's the most stabilizing thing the United States could do, because right off the bat, we take the onus off of Europe. We basically have said, you guys can't do it, therefore we're going to do it. And that size force will basically, it's a check to any thought by Russia of aggression action. Not that Russia's thinking that, but it basically it just takes that off the board. Mm-hmm. We don't have to worry about anything from Russia, because now we have the troops there that can kick the snot out of them. So we need to do that if we're serious about sustaining NATO, sustaining this transatlantic alliance. If we're not willing to do that, and we're not because we can't afford it, then we need to come.
Scott, we're going to have to close this here, but again, agreed, and I thank you very much for your commentary. The voice you guys are listening to is Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. You can follow Scott on Twitter at RealScottRitter. You guys are listening to Faultlines with Thomas and Pelly. We'll be back in a moment.